Jonathan Hayes stood in the bustling heart of the first-class lounge, his sharp, tailored suit blending seamlessly with the elegant surroundings. The lounge was a sanctuary for those accustomed to luxury, its marble floors gleaming under soft, ambient lighting, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint hum of distant conversations. It was a world of calm, where the pace slowed and the noise of the outside world was muted. But for Jonathan, there was an undercurrent of tension that never quite went away. He had flown more miles than most would in a lifetime, had crossed continents to close multi-million-dollar deals, and yet, here he was, in a place where he should have been afforded the utmost respect, facing an indignity he would not soon forget. Despite his appearance, a meticulously pressed suit from Savile Row, an understated yet expensive watch, glinting softly under the lights, he was treated like any other passenger in the lounge. As he sat at a table near the window, scrolling through business analytics on his tablet, he could feel the subtle, almost imperceptible glances cast in his direction. They weren't the kind of glances a man like him should receive. They were the glances of someone trying to place him in the world of privilege, a world he belonged to, but one the staff appeared to struggle to accept. His mind was far from the glances of the few passengers who passed by. He was thinking about the acquisition that loomed in front of him, the delicate negotiations he would soon lead. His company, Hayes Innovations, had revolutionized logistics management. Every major airline in the world depended on the precision of his software, a system so advanced it was practically invisible in its efficiency. But none of that mattered here. All that mattered was the assumption, a simple yet damaging prejudice, that a man like him could not possibly belong in the first-class lounge. As he turned his focus back to the screen, Jonathan could feel the presence of Brenda, the lounge attendant, as she approached. He had noticed her earlier, her perfectly pinned hair and polite but tight smile, but she didn't make eye contact as she passed him by. She served others, offering refills of espresso to the suits and fresh pastries to the older businessmen, but not once did she approach him. Not once did she even glance at his table as if he weren't important enough to acknowledge. It was an odd feeling for a man like Jonathan, used to being in control of every room he walked into. Minutes passed, and the silence in the lounge remained undisturbed, except for the low murmur of voices and the occasional rustle of a newspaper. Jonathan sighed, adjusting his posture in his chair as he packed away his tablet. He needed to board soon, his flight to London critical for his upcoming merger. Flight 88 to Heathrow was calling his name. He stood, his movements smooth, purposeful. He walked toward the gate, his gait unhurried but deliberate. His mind was already running through the possibilities of the meeting ahead. However, as he approached the gate agent, Carol Peterson, there was no acknowledgement of who he was, no smile of recognition, no respect for the business titan in front of her. Instead, she offered a mechanical smile to the couple behind him, nodding her head in polite efficiency as she guided them forward. When Jonathan stepped up to her, she gave him only a cursory glance before turning back to her computer. "May I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone flat, dismissive. Jonathan handed over his phone with the e-boarding pass visible. She scanned it with a practiced flick of her fingers. He could already feel the tension mounting. Her eyes narrowed, a frown forming as she tapped at the screen. "There seems to be an issue with your seat, sir. It's showing that your first-class seat is no longer available." Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm, even as frustration simmered just beneath the surface. "I have a confirmed seat in first class. It's 2A. I booked it 2 months ago." Her fingers continued to tap at the screen, as if he wasn't even there, the worry of the scanner cutting through the quiet tension in the air. "We had an equipment change," she muttered dismissively. "The new aircraft doesn't have your seat. We can accommodate you in premium economy, seat 24B. His gaze hardened. The equipment change excuse was the same one he'd heard from dozens of airlines, but Jonathan knew better. With his company's software embedded in nearly every major airline's operation, he knew exactly what had been happening on every plane. There was no equipment change, notification. The lie was transparent. He wasn't just being downgraded, he was being dismissed. The moment wasn't about the seat, at least, not in the way Carol thought. Jonathan could have accepted the inconvenience, played along with the procedure, but this was more than a mistake. This was a power move disguised as a logistical error. The insult hit him like a slap, but he didn't react as others might have. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand explanations. Instead, he simply stood there, quiet and composed, letting the weight of the moment build. "I'm sorry, sir," Carol repeated, almost as if she were trying to convince herself of the truth of her own words. "There's nothing I can do. We're fully booked in first class." Jonathan's eyes briefly met hers, a glimmer of calm fury in their depths. "I'm not asking for compensation," he said, his voice low but clear. "I am simply stating that I belong in that seat." Carol hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by his response. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted as the Albrights, the couple behind Jonathan, were ushered forward and waved into first class. It wasn't just a slight against him, it was an overt dismissal. Jonathan glanced at his phone. He could feel his pulse quicken, but he remained in control, locking away the surge of indignation. "I paid for first class," he said evenly. "I expect to be treated as such." The message wasn't lost on her, but the look on Carol's face was one of forced patience. Clearly, Jonathan's presence in the first-class line was as unwelcome as his calm demand. Little did she know, the moment she'd just created was the beginning of something far greater, something that would soon make their small, personal slight feel like a catastrophic misstep. Jonathan Hayes wasn't the type of CEO who made grand entrances or craved the spotlight. He wasn't a flashy billionaire who flaunted his wealth or his power in front of the media. Instead, he was the kind of man who blended into a room, his presence quietly commanding respect without the need for boastful displays. If you asked most people in the tech world who Jonathan Hayes was, they would describe him in simple terms: a visionary, a strategist, and a master of data analytics. At 42, Hayes had already built an empire, his company, Hayes Innovations, becoming a powerhouse in logistics and data management. While many might have recognized his company's technology at the core of global operations, few knew the man behind the algorithms that powered it. Hayes Innovations didn't just offer software. It provided the very backbone that ran the world's airlines, retailers, and shipping giants. 30% of the world's aviation fleet and countless supply chains relied on the precise, data-driven system. Hayes had developed a system so finely tuned that it had become the invisible thread tying the global economy together. But his rise to the top hadn't been easy. Jonathan's story wasn't one of privilege, nor was it shaped by a golden opportunity handed to him. He wasn't born into wealth, and he didn't attend the Ivy League schools that most people would expect of a tech mogul. Instead, Hayes grew up in a small blue-collar town in the Midwest, where opportunities were scarce and dreams were harder to chase. Raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to support their family, Jonathan learned early that nothing would be handed to him. The value of hard work and the importance of strategy were instilled in him from a young age. As a child, he would watch his mother stretch every penny, managing their small apartment's budget down to the last cent. Jonathan had learned to approach every challenge methodically. If life threw him an obstacle, he didn't react impulsively. He calculated, he analyzed, he adjusted. This mindset translated perfectly when he eventually found his way into the world of tech. He wasn't the loudest or the most outgoing at the coding boot camp he attended, but he was relentless. While others focused on the latest trends or the flashiest new ideas, Jonathan honed his craft, focusing on solving real-world problems with data and precision. By the time he founded Hayes Innovations, Jonathan had already gained a reputation in the tech community, not as a charismatic genius, but as the quiet disruptor who saw patterns where others saw noise. His company's first major success came when he built a logistics platform that connected suppliers, retailers, and transport companies in a way that no one had thought possible. It was a quiet revolution, but the impact was undeniable. But software wasn't flashy or easy to understand. It was technical, efficient, and, most importantly, it worked. His platform had eliminated inefficiencies that plagued global supply chains for years, saving companies billions in lost revenue and time. However, Jonathan wasn't satisfied. His ambition extended beyond just logistics. He had always believed that the real power lay in the data itself, the ability to predict, to optimize, to automate, and that belief became the driving force behind Hayes Innovations. Under Jonathan's leadership, the company developed proprietary algorithms that powered air traffic management, cargo logistics, and supply chain operations across the globe. Hayes Innovations had become the unseen lifeblood of global commerce, its reach far greater than most would imagine. From the flight paths of cargo jets to the supply chains that stocked your local store, Jonathan's work was everywhere, and yet few knew his name. Despite the success, Hayes kept a low profile. He didn't attend galas or speak at conferences. Instead, he worked behind closed doors, crafting strategies, ensuring his company's dominance in the background. For years, the public remained largely unaware of Hayes Innovations' role in the global economy. Jonathan didn't want fame. He wanted control. Control over the system, over the data, over the future. And in many ways, he had it. But this level of control came with its own set of problems. Hayes didn't just influence how airlines managed their fleets or how global supply chains operated. He held the keys to some of the most critical systems in the world, and that was a dangerous thing. There were few people who could truly challenge Jonathan, but those who tried quickly learned that his quiet demeanor masked a ruthless determination. What set Jonathan apart wasn't just his brilliance with algorithms, it was his ability to think several steps ahead. He understood how people worked, how systems interacted, how even the smallest misstep could have catastrophic consequences. He could foresee problems before they arose, and had contingencies for contingencies. He was a tactician, and he approached every situation as a puzzle to be solved, efficiently, decisively, without hesitation. But beneath the surface of the calm CEO was something darker, a quiet rage that had simmered for years. It wasn't just the long hours, or the pressure of maintaining his company's success. It was the constant struggle against the prejudice and dismissal he faced as a man of color in a world that was still far too comfortable with its biases. Time and time again, Jonathan had been underestimated, dismissed, or outright ignored. Whether it was in boardrooms or airports, people looked at him and saw what they expected to see, a person out of place. And he had grown tired of it as he boarded Flight 88 that fateful day. Heading to London for a crucial business acquisition, Jonathan Hayes was on the verge of a breakthrough, one that would cement his legacy. But what happened next would change the course of his journey forever. The hum of the airport terminal was a dull roar, a background noise that Jonathan Hayes had long since learned to tune out. He wasn't here to listen to the chatter of passengers or the announcements blaring overhead. No, he was here for business, the type of business that made airlines, even giants like Transatlantic Air, reliant on his company's logistics systems. As he made his way through the terminal, the sleek black of his tailored suit reflected the cool precision with which he operated. He was a man used to control, to having every detail of his journey meticulously arranged. This wasn't just another business trip. It was a pivotal moment. He was on his way to London to close a multi-billion-dollar merger that would make Hayes Innovations the undisputed leader in global logistics. Technology? It would solidify his company's place at the top of an industry that touched everything from air travel to e-commerce. Every flight he took was a mere formality, an inconvenience to be navigated on his way to the next big deal. He had long since gotten used to the perks of first-class travel, the spacious seats, the attention to detail, the sense of quiet privilege. But today, as he approached gate A17, a sharp chill gripped his chest. Something was off. He stepped up to the podium, where the gate agent, Carol Peterson, sat, her face painted with the bland professionalism of someone who'd been doing this job for far too long. Her expression shifted briefly as she scanned him, a momentary flicker of judgment, an assessment she didn't bother to hide. Jonathan had experienced this before, and it always left a bitter taste in his mouth. It was as if people couldn't reconcile his success with his appearance. He wasn't the prototypical CEO they expected, and that subtle bias was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. "Good morning, sir. May I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone polite but cold. Jonathan handed over his phone, where the e-boarding pass was displayed. Carol scanned the barcode, her eyes briefly flicking over the details. The corner of her mouth twitched slightly, a micro-expression he couldn't ignore. He could feel the first stirrings of something amiss. She tapped at her keyboard, her fingers moving faster than the usual casual scan, a tightness in her movements that made Jonathan's brow furrow ever so slightly. The pause lingered longer than it should have, a beat of uncertainty that echoed louder in his mind with every second. Finally, she looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since his arrival. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice almost apologetic, though her eyes never left the screen. "There seems to be a problem with your seat." Jonathan's heart rate quickened, though his face remained an impassive mask. "A problem with my seat? I have a confirmed first-class ticket." Carol's fingers tapped rapidly at the screen. "It appears there's a seating conflict. The system shows that your seat has already been assigned to someone else." Jonathan held his ground, his calm voice a stark contrast to the growing knot in his stomach. "That's impossible. I booked my seat 2 months ago. I'm flying first class, and I expect to be treated as such." Her gaze flickered back to the screen, her eyes narrowing. "I'm afraid there's nothing I can do. We've had an equipment change. The new plane has a different configuration, and first class is fully booked. We can offer you a seat in premium economy, 24B. Jonathan's chest tightened, his fingers gripping the edges of the counter with just enough force to feel the cool metal beneath his skin. The lie was obvious. He knew the configuration of every single aircraft that used his company's system, and Transatlantic Air's fleet had not experienced a sudden equipment change without notice. This was no mistake. It was something else, something deliberate. "I paid for first class," he said evenly, keeping his tone steady, though his patience was beginning to fray. "I expect to sit in the seat I've paid for." Carol's smile didn't falter, but her eyes held something else, irritation, maybe even a hint of disdain. "I understand your frustration, sir, but the cabin is full. You can either take the seat in premium economy, or we can rebook you on another flight." Her tone had shifted, now carrying an edge of finality that suggested this was no longer up for debate. Jonathan's mind raced. How far would they push this? He was no stranger to navigating uncomfortable situations. In his years of building Hayes Innovations, he had learned the art of control, the subtle ways to manage emotions, to diffuse tension before it turned into something uncontrollable. But here, in this moment, standing at the gate of a company that relied on his software, he felt a deeper insult. It wasn't just the downgrade to economy. It wasn't even the disrespect from the gate agent. It was the complete lack of recognition for his status, his power, the influence he held. This wasn't just about the seat. Behind him, he could hear the Albrights, a couple laughing and chatting as they were ushered into the first-class cabin. The juxtaposition couldn't have been clearer. They were allowed to board with ease, their smiles wide and unconcerned. But Jonathan stood there, silently processing the microaggressions piling up. His status wasn't being acknowledged. His very humanity was being questioned by an airline that relied on his technology to stay in business. The gate area had begun to fill with other passengers, their faces painted with curiosity, impatience, and growing discomfort. As Jonathan remained locked in a silent standoff with Carol, the atmosphere began to shift, becoming a spectator sport. The eyes of those around him drifted toward him, some with sympathy, others with judgment, but all of them were watching, waiting for something to happen. "Sir," Carol said again, her voice now sharp, "we need to make a decision. I'm afraid we don't have any first-class seats available on this flight." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice low and unshaken. "I paid for first class. I expect to sit in the seat I was assigned." The tension hung thick in the air, each word exchanged punctuating the mounting unease. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, the silent judgment of the other passengers whispering, "Why isn't he just taking the seat in economy?" But this wasn't about the seat. It was about the system, the prejudice, the assumption that he didn't belong. And Jonathan Hayes, the quiet CEO who had built an empire on systems, would not let that lie stand. The words, "premium economy," 2-4B lingered in the air, hanging there like an insult. Jonathan Hayes didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. Instead, he did what he always did when faced with an obstacle. He took control. There was no anger in his expression, just the quiet intensity of a man who had already calculated the next move, a man who knew exactly how to turn this minor injustice into something far more significant. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to accept the downgrade. Maybe he could just sit in that cramped middle seat, he thought. Maybe he could let it go, let it slide, but something inside him snapped. This wasn't just about the seat, it was about everything. The years of being underestimated, the quiet dismissals that built up over time, the constant feeling that people assumed his success was a fluke. He had fought for everything he had built, and today, he was going to make sure they understood that his power, his status, was not up for debate. Jonathan's gaze didn't waver from Carol. He stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, studying her face, letting the silence settle between them. Carol, unsure of what to make of his calm, tried once more to placate him. "Sir, I really don't have any other options for you. We've tried to accommodate all the passengers. If you'd like, we can have our customer service team handle the complaint once you're on board." Jonathan's lips parted slightly, and he spoke, his voice low but unmistakably commanding. "I'll be on this flight, Carol, but I won't be taking that seat." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The weight of the device felt almost ceremonial in his hand, a symbol of the control he wielded. He unlocked it with a swift gesture, swiping across the screen to open a direct line to Mia Sullivan, his chief operations officer. As the phone rang, the ambient noise of the airport seemed to fade into the background, as if the world itself had slowed down in response to the magnitude of the call. Mia Sullivan answered on the third ring. Her voice was calm, the kind of tone that spoke volumes about her experience in managing crisis after crisis. She had worked with Jonathan for years, long enough to understand that when he called, it wasn't for a casual conversation. "Mia," Jonathan began, his voice steady, his words chosen with careful precision. "I need you to initiate Protocol 0 on the transatlantic account. Authorization code, Zeta Alpha 23. Make it happen now." Mia's response was almost immediate. "Understood. Are we sure about this?" Jonathan's reply was simple, unwavering. "I'm sure." The conversation lasted no more than 30 seconds, but the weight of it was felt deeply in the pulse of the airline's operations. As he ended the call, Jonathan slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression still calm, his mind already moving to the next step in the carefully orchestrated series of events. The air around him seemed to change. It was subtle, but for those who were paying attention, it was impossible to ignore. Carol stared at him for a moment, her expression a mix of confusion and skepticism. She had no idea what had just transpired, nor would she have understood it, even if she did. Across the terminal, the clock ticked away. Passengers boarded, the announcements continued to echo, and flight attendants bustled about their routines. But in the background, far beyond the gates, a shift was happening. Protocol Zero was already beginning to take effect, quietly, silently, and with the precision that only someone like Jonathan Hayes could command. Back at the airline's Global Operations Control Center GOCC, the first signs of trouble emerged within minutes. At first, it was a series of minor glitches, small errors that no one could quite explain. Crew scheduling problems, ticketing issues, fueling discrepancies, things that, on their own, seemed manageable. But for the engineers and dispatchers working in the high-tech nerve center of the airline, these small glitches were the beginning of something much worse. Maria Flores, a senior dispatcher overseeing the morning's flights, was the first to notice the oddity. She looked at her monitor, perplexed. "What's going on with Flight 214? The system is showing a crew assignment failure." Chuck, the system's technician standing nearby, walked over to her screen, squinting. "Probably just a minor server lag," he muttered, tapping away at his keyboard. "I'll try to manually override it." He pressed a few keys, expecting the issue to resolve itself. But when the message flashed back on the screen, it was worse than he anticipated. "System integrity hold. Manual override denied." Chuck paused. This wasn't a normal error. His eyebrows furrowed. "This isn't a regular glitch. Let me escalate this to Nexus." Meanwhile, the ticketing systems were beginning to fail as well. A baggage supervisor in Chicago couldn't generate the flight manifest for his incoming flight, and a fuel logistics coordinator in Miami found his requests for fuel approval rejected by the system. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was spreading, like an invisible wave crashing through the airline's entire network. The effects were slowly cascading through the system, and the first whispers of panic began to circulate within the control center. Something was wrong, something serious. But at this point, no one knew how deep the disruption ran, or who had triggered it. Back at the gate, Jonathan Hayes was still standing in the same spot, unbothered by the chaos unfolding around him. He knew exactly what was happening. Protocol Zero wasn't just a technical glitch or a simple shut-off switch. It was a systemic safeguard he had put in place years ago, designed to protect his company's interests at all costs. It was embedded deep within the Nexus logistics architecture, so deeply in fact, that its existence was known only to a handful of people. Its purpose simple: if any of his clients, like Transatlantic Air, violated the integrity of their contract, whether through negligence, breach of agreement, or, in this case, blatant disrespect, the system would retaliate. With surgical precision, Protocol Zero shut down every critical operational element of Transatlantic's global network. Flight plans couldn't be filed, baggage couldn't be loaded, crew assignments were blocked. Within minutes, the entire airline was paralyzed, and the company's executives would have no idea who or what was behind it. Jonathan stood by the gate as passengers continued to board, oblivious to the fact that his phone call had just set in motion a series of events that would soon bring one of the world's largest airlines to its knees. The only sound in his ears was the soft murmur of the terminal's hum and the faint thrum of engines in the distance. His expression remained neutral, even as he knew that the chaos he had set into motion would soon become undeniable. Inside the airplane, Flight 88 to London. Jonathan Hayes sat in seat 24B, his phone now tucked away. His eyes were fixed forward, but his mind was a million miles away. The events at the gate, the slight of being shoved into a seat that didn't match his ticket, seemed almost trivial now. He had already won. The real battle had been fought not in the lounge or at the gate, But in the unseen world of logistics and code that Jonathan had spent years perfecting around him, the noise of the flight began to fade into a comfortable drone, the overhead lights dimming as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff. But the war was just beginning. As the plane climbed into the sky, the effects of his decision were becoming clearer. Rippling across the company, the industry, and beyond, it began with a single, unassuming email. Just a brief message from Kenji Tanaka, Jonathan Hayes' lead systems architect, that read, Protocol 0, initial cascade complete. Verification holds are populating. Estimated time to critical system failure, 45 minutes. Godspeed. At Nexus Logistics, Jonathan Hayes' company, those words were enough to send a ripple through the air. To the uninitiated, it was a routine update. But to those who knew what the Protocol 0 activation meant, it was a harbinger of something much darker, far from the calm control of Hayes' office. A digital war had just begun. In Transatlantic Air's Global Operations Control Center, GOCC, in Dallas, chaos was just starting to unfold. Maria Flores, the senior dispatcher, was the first to feel the weight of the breach. It started small, a flicker on her screen, a minor glitch that made her second-guess the flight status for Flight 214 from Dallas to Frankfurt. But that flicker quickly became a ripple, and that ripple turned into a wave. She checked her system, again, only to be greeted with the same error message. System integrity, hold. Manual override denied. Her mind raced, but she quickly tried to troubleshoot the issue, assuming it was a server error or some technical issue that could be fixed. But the problem didn't stop there. Other dispatchers were beginning to report similar issues, all stemming from the same source, a data hold. One by one, the flight icons on the massive wall map in the control center, each representing active flights from the airline, began to blink red. A dozen flights, each with hundreds of passengers on board, were now grounded. The sight of the red blinking dots on the map sent a shockwave through the control center. It wasn't just a few delays, it was the beginning of a full-blown operational collapse. Back in New York, at JFK Airport, the first cracks in Transatlantic Air's carefully maintained facade began to show. Passengers on Flight 88, bound for London, had no idea that their flight was now just a tiny cog in the larger machine, grinding to a halt. The flight was scheduled to depart in a little over an hour, but as Carol Peterson, the gate agent, checked her systems, she was met with an alarming message: no clearance. Flight status blocked. The more she checked, the worse the situation became. The flight could no longer be cleared for departure. Passenger manifests were locked, fueling orders were rejected, and crew assignments couldn't be processed. With each error message, Carol's confusion grew. Her attempts to escalate the issue to a supervisor went unanswered. Something was wrong, fundamentally wrong. But what? She could feel the pressure mounting. Passengers were starting to notice the delays, the confusion. Uncertainty rippled through the crowd. They had no idea that the small inconvenience they were facing was the result of a systemic failure that was unfolding on a global scale. Meanwhile, in London, Tokyo, Miami, Chicago, and Los Angeles, the situation was no better. Flight after flight, 150 flights in total, was grounded across key hubs. Some planes sat fully boarded on the tarmac, their passengers growing increasingly frustrated as the minutes stretched into hours. Other planes, already in the air, were forced into holding patterns. As flight plans couldn't be filed or updated, the financial implications were immediately apparent. Stock prices for Transatlantic Air plummeted in real time as traders reacted to the unfolding disaster. Within the first hour, the airline's stock had dropped more than 5%, a massive loss for a company of its size. The markets were reeling, but it was just the beginning. As more and more flight cancellations stacked up, the financial damage began to snowball. Each grounded flight represented a massive loss in fuel costs, crew salaries, and airport fees. Then, There were the unruly passengers, thousands, stranded without any clear direction, many of whom were now seeking refunds or rebooking. The PR disaster began to unfold even faster than the technical meltdown. In the midst of all this, the leadership at Transatlantic Air had no idea what was happening. Thomas Davies, the airline's CEO, had spent the better part of the morning in a meeting with a government representative about new regulatory changes. He didn't know that his empire was slowly crumbling. When his phone rang, it was not the usual calls from his team about quarterly earnings or flight schedules. No, this call came with a sense of urgency he had never experienced. "Mr. Davies," the voice on the other end said, "you need to get to the Global Operations Control Center, now." The fear in the technician's voice was enough to rattle him. "What's going on?" he asked, though he already knew this wasn't going to be a minor issue. The dispatcher told him that a system failure was spreading throughout Transatlantic's entire network. Flight schedules were down, crew assignments were locked, the ticketing systems had crashed. "This isn't a glitch, sir," the technician said. "This is something different." Davies felt his stomach sink. The global network of Transatlantic, the very foundation on which the airline was built, was unraveling before his eyes, and he had no idea why. Inside the Global Operations Control Center, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The real-time map on the wall had gone from showing a precise, smooth flow of flights to a chaotic mess of red icons. By now, 152 aircraft, from Los Angeles to Tokyo, London to New York, were effectively frozen. They were grounded, fully fueled, and ready to take off, but their digital flight plans could not be validated by the system. These planes were stuck on the tarmac, their departures blocked by an unseen force that no one could yet explain. It was the kind of catastrophe no airline executive could ever fathom. Their IT infrastructure, which they had trusted implicitly for years, was now working against them. Every attempt to manually override the errors was met with the same response: system integrity hold. The phone lines were flooded with calls, but the answers remained the same. Transatlantic's core system had been compromised, but it wasn't a technical failure. It was a digital blockade, triggered by something deep within the Nexus logistics system. The airline's entire operation was being held hostage, and as the minutes ticked by, the financial damage continued to climb. The ticker at the bottom of the control center's massive screen flashed in red: revenue loss. The number started at $500 million, but it was growing exponentially with each passing minute in the boardroom of Transatlantic Air. The panic had already reached its boiling point. Richard Maxwell, the coup, looked up from the screen as he absorbed the magnitude of the situation. His face was pale. "We're looking at a multi-billion-dollar loss in less than 2 hours, he muttered, barely able to comprehend what was happening. Elena Vance, the CFO, was already calculating the costs. "If this isn't fixed immediately, we're talking about a total collapse of the airline's operations. We need to issue a public statement before this gets any worse." But as the situation worsened, it became clear that no press release or public statement could fix the issue. What they didn't know yet was that the reason their entire system had gone down was because of a single phone call made by Jonathan Hayes. They didn't know that the Nexus logistics system had quietly locked them out, activated by a clause in their contract that they hadn't taken seriously. The airline had no idea that they had just been forced to face a reckoning. Not through hacking, not through sabotage, but through a simple digital lock. Thomas Davies sat at the head of the long, polished table in the executive boardroom, his fingers drumming lightly against the wood. The room was cold, sterile, a far cry from the warmth and calm that he had once taken pride in. Today, it felt like a tomb, silent, heavy, and filled with unspoken tension. The chaos unfolding at Transatlantic Air was beyond his control now. The situation had spiraled far quicker than he could have imagined. 152 flights grounded, The airline's operations paralyzed, and every second the revenue lost multiplied. His company, once a symbol of global efficiency and reliability, was now the subject of an unfolding public relations nightmare, and it was all because of one phone call. The phone on the table buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen. It was the CFO, Elalina Vance, urgently requesting an update. He ignored it for a moment, his mind still reeling from the sheer magnitude of what was happening. How could this happen? How could one person, one phone call, bring an empire like his to the brink of collapse? But there was no time for second-guessing. The CEO of Nexus Logistics, Jonathan Hayes, was on the line. The phone buzzed again. Davies let out a deep breath, knowing he had no choice. Hayes had to be dealt with, and now it was time to face the man who had orchestrated this chaos. He picked up the phone and hit the speaker button, the sound of a soft exhale on the other end, signaling that Hayes was waiting. "Mr. Hayes," Davies began, his voice strained but composed. "This situation is..." He stopped. There was no point in trying to sugarcoat it. Unacceptable. The voice on the other end was smooth, measured, calm. "Yes, it is," Jonathan replied, his words quiet, but each one cutting through the tension like a blade. "Unacceptable is a mild way of putting it, Mr. Davies." The silence that followed was loaded with the weight of their conversation. Hayes' tone remained cool, yet the underlying power in his words was undeniable. "I trust you're aware that your airline is effectively grounded. Global operations are on hold because of the actions of your employees. Your control center is completely paralyzed." Davies clenched his jaw. This was not how he'd envisioned his day going. He had built a career on steering transatlantic air through turbulence, but now it felt like he was being tossed about in a storm of his own making. "I'm aware," he said, trying to maintain composure. "We're doing everything we can, but we need your cooperation here. I'm sure we can find a solution." Hayes chuckled softly. "A solution? How about a solution that involves accountability, Mr. Davies?" He paused for a moment. "This isn't just about technical failure. This is about the system you've built, a system that has ignored the fundamental principle of respect. You've shown me none, and now your airline is paying the price. Let's start with that." The words stung, and Davies felt his face flush with frustration, but he knew there was no point in arguing. Hayes wasn't interested in apologies or justifications. He had already made up his mind. He was in control. Hayes' voice was steady, his tone almost clinical as he continued. "I'm not interested in your excuses. What I need from you, Mr. Davies, are three things. First, a public acknowledgement of the incident that took place today. I want you to own this. I want you to publicly apologize for the actions of your employees at JFK Airport, and I want you to name them Carol Peterson and Gary Mendes." Davies' stomach churned. Publicly naming the employees would not just be a scandal, it would ignite a firestorm. It would be a public crucifixion of two workers who had likely acted out of ignorance, not malice. But Hayes wasn't asking for something small. He was demanding the ultimate public humiliation. He couldn't let his voice crack, so Davies himself. "You're asking me to sacrifice my people for a mistake that..." Hayes cut him off. "Mistake? It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate act of disrespect. They made a decision to treat me as someone unworthy of my seat, someone who didn't belong in their first-class world." His voice dropped lower, colder. "And that was a systemic failure on your part. You allowed this kind of discrimination to flourish in your company. That's the real problem, Thomas. The culture you've created." Davies' mind raced. He wanted to argue. He wanted to deflect. But there was something in Hayes' tone, something unshakable, something that made Davies realize just how outmatched he was. Hayes wasn't asking for a simple apology. He was reclaiming his power, stripping Davies of any semblance of control. "Second, Mr. Davies, Hayes continued, his voice now laced with authority. I want you to fire the 2 individuals responsible. Carol and Gary must be terminated immediately. No severance, no compensation, just termination for cause. If you can't do that, I will. Davy's eyes widened, and his mind raced through the implications. Firing employees in such a public manner would be a PR disaster in itself. But the alternative, refusing Hayes' demands, was far worse. The consequences of this standoff had already cost them billions in lost revenue. What would it cost if he didn't comply? Third, and this is non-negotiable, Hayes' voice hardened, as if delivering a verdict. You will create a $50 million fund, fully managed by an independent third party, and dedicated to anti-bias and escalation training within your company. This will be a 10-year commitment, and the results will be made public every year. Your company will fund it, and you will personally contribute the full amount of your last 2 years of bonuses. Davies froze, his breath hitched. The money wasn't the issue. It was the power behind the request. Hayes wasn't just dictating the terms of a settlement. He was remaking the very foundation of Transatlantic Air's corporate culture. And it wasn't just the money. It was the humiliation of his position. A company CEO being forced to make these concessions was unthinkable. But here Hayes was, calling the shots with a level of certainty that left Davies feeling helpless. And last, Mr. Davies, until all of this is completed, until I receive confirmation that your people have been fired, the fund has been established, and the public apology has been made, you will not have access to Protocol Zero. Your systems will remain locked, and your entire global fleet will remain grounded. You'll get nothing. Nothing will change until these terms are met. Davies sat in stunned silence, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. It was clear now. He wasn't negotiating with a mere CEO. He was negotiating with the man who held the keys to his company's future. Every second that passed felt like a hammer pounding down on his chest. His empire was crumbling, and he had no control over the next move. Mr. Hayes, Davies said, his voice barely a whisper, you're asking for too much. We're talking about the future of my company. The public backlash, the investors, the board, ... You've already lost them, Hayes responded, the finality in his voice unmistakable. You allowed your company to get here. I am giving you a chance to fix it. But only on my terms. The day after the video call, as the dust settled, the scale of the consequences became increasingly clear. Transatlantic Air was officially in crisis mode. The news of the grounded flights and the $2.1 billion financial loss spread like wildfire across news outlets, social media, and financial reports. It was a corporate disaster of unimaginable proportions, one that had shaken the airline to its core. Inside the Global Operations Control Center, GOCC, the staff worked tirelessly to restore order, but the damage was done. Protocol Zero had done its job. Systemic paralysis had shown how deeply vulnerable the airline's infrastructure was. The system had been locked down, its operations completely frozen until Hayes' demands were met. Within 24 hours of the call, with Hayes, Carol Peterson, and Gary Mendes, the 2 employees who had dismissed him at the gate were fired without severance. The move sent shockwaves through the airline industry. Employees and executives alike were stunned. Transatlantic's leadership had no choice but to follow through on Hayes' demands. But it didn't stop there. A full-scale corporate restructuring was underway. Transatlantic's CEO, Thomas Davies, was forced to issue an unprecedented public apology. He appeared on national television, standing alone in a spotlight, as he admitted the company's failure. For the first time, a major corporate CEO publicly acknowledged and named the racial bias embedded in his company's culture. The apology wasn't just words, it was a reckoning. Davies had to acknowledge that his company's culture, its deep-rooted prejudices, and its incompetence in handling customer complaints had cost them dearly. He spoke of reform, the establishment of a $50 million fund to support anti-bias training and de-escalation programs. The decision to speak openly about the incident, naming names, and outlining the necessary steps for change, was one of the most humbling moments of his career. But it also marked the beginning of Transatlantic's long road to recovery. Despite the corporate restructuring and public apology, the financial damage continued to mount. Transatlantic's stock market value continued to plummet, dropping another 20% in the first week following the grounding of flights. Investors were outraged, demanding accountability at the highest levels. The shareholder revolt gained momentum, with calls for Davies' resignation coming from multiple directions. The financial repercussions were devastating, and the airline was left scrambling to find a way to reassure both its passengers and its investors that they could recover. But slowly, over the course of several weeks, the stock began to stabilize. The airline's public relations strategy had been carefully curated. The $50 million fund, which was created as per Hayes' demand, was presented as a commitment to cultural change and corporate integrity, leading to some cautious optimism in the markets. While the scars would take years to heal, the airline was beginning to show signs of recovery. Meanwhile, Hayes Innovations was positioned as an industry leader in corporate reform. Hayes Company, which had once operated mostly in the background, was now lauded for its pivotal role in exposing systemic corporate issues within one of the world's largest airlines. The incident became a case study in corporate justice, where strategic thinking turned a moment of personal insult into a business triumph. Hayes, however, was indifferent to the accolades. His objective was never fame, nor was it personal revenge. His goal had always been to enforce change, not through emotional outbursts, but through calculated actions that reshaped an entire industry. In a board meeting a few days after the crisis, Hayes sat quietly, observing his team discussing the consequences of the event. As they praised his actions and the strategic brilliance behind Protocol Zero, Hayes' mind was already focused on the next challenge. He wasn't one to bask in victory for long. The broader cultural impact of the incident was undeniable. The story of Jonathan Hayes, a black CEO, fighting against racial prejudice in the corporate world, resonated with millions. News outlets, social media influencers, and activists began to use Hayes as a symbol of the fight against corporate discrimination. In boardrooms across the globe, his actions sparked discussions about diversity, inclusivity, and the need for systemic change within major corporations. The $50 million fund was established within weeks, with an independent board of sociologists and civil rights leaders overseeing the implementation of mandatory diversity and de-escalation training for all employees of Transatlantic Air. The fund, managed separately, became a model for corporate accountability across multiple industries, forcing companies to confront their own internal biases, even in the most conservative circles. Hayes was hailed as a pioneer of corporate reform, but it wasn't just about the money, it was about the message. The message that power didn't have to be flaunted through expensive cars or public displays of wealth. Instead, Hayes had used his intellect, his strategic thinking, and his calm authority to bring about a momentous shift in an entire industry. He had proven that the most powerful response to injustice wasn't loud protest, but quiet, calculated retribution. As weeks turned into months, Transatlantic's brand began to slowly recover. Their internal culture was no longer defined by arrogance and dismissiveness. They began to train their staff, reevaluating their approach to customer service, employee respect, and cultural sensitivity. The airline began to publicly embrace its renewed commitment to creating an inclusive and fair work environment for all employees. But the true legacy of the incident wasn't about the public apology or the restructuring. It was the change in corporate mindset that Hayes had sparked. Jonathan Hayes had forced an entire industry to take a long, hard look at its biases, its priorities, and its systems. In the end, The incident at JFK Airport was no longer just about a wrongly assigned seat or the petty humiliation of a black CEO. It had become something far bigger. It had become a wake-up call for the corporate world, a lesson in accountability, and a blueprint for how calm, strategic action could bring down the largest empires. As for Hayes, his victory was sealed, not with headlines, but with quiet reflection. He watched as his company's reforms took shape, his mind already shifting towards the next challenge. The world had been changed, not by the loudest voice in the room, but by the quietest.